My husband and I had rented a downstairs apartment in a 1940s bungalow house after we married. During the first few months, our place felt comfortable. No weird anything. I mean, at least none we had noticed. Learning I was pregnant, I excitedly waited for my husband to return home after work that evening to tell him the good news. While watching TV in the living room, I heard a knocking from above, clearly sounding like it came from the ceiling. It had to be my mother-in-law who lived upstairs. What could she be doing? About 10 minutes later, I heard the knocking again. There was no pattern, just a constant, mild knock. I decided to see if she was trying to get my attention and trotted around the house to ring the front doorbell. Answering, she told me she had no time for my silliness, for it was not her knocking. I didn't know what to make of it. We only lived there 6 more months because I heard it at least once a week coming from the living room ceiling. Fearing my mother-in-law's house was haunted, we moved out before our son was born. But it did no good. The knocking followed us no matter where we lived, coming from above, always above. When we lived in a townhouse, we were on the top floor, and if anyone was knocking on our ceiling, they had to be in the storage area of the attic. The entrance was just outside our front door and always locked. Besides the landlord, we were the only ones with a key. If I heard the knocking, I'd go out and stand guard in front of the locked storage door, waiting for my husband to come home, and would make him search every square inch of the place. There had to be someone there, but no one was ever found. It was a little frustrating for my husband. It was not like he didn't believe me, it's just that he was never around when the knocking occurred. It would be a couple years later that I learned my son could hear it too. While in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes, the knocking started, but it was followed by a different knocking pattern. It seemed to be coming from my son's room, who was 4 at the time. There he was, standing on a bed, reaching as high as he could, knocking on the wall in response to the knock in the ceiling. It was a game to him. That unhinged me a little. I swooped him off the bed and he slept with us that night. At the time, my best guess was we were dealing with a ghost who was following us. So who are you going to call? The paranormal investigation team came with promises to help and brought in all kinds of equipment like cameras and recording devices. Basically taking over our home for 2 weeks and eating all our food. The knocking was heard and recorded, but they could not find the cause. Not having any answers, the group packed up and left. They never came back nor returned any of my calls. Not having a clue on what to do, I convinced myself the knocking was unusual, but not dangerous, learning over time to ignore it. There was this one unnerving incident, though. When my son was 10, I could not get into his room one morning. After letting me in, he explained how last night he was awoken by a noise coming from downstairs. Peeking out his door, he stared into the dark and saw a shadow of a very large man moving up the stairs, but he wasn't walking right. He didn't know who it was, and being very scared, closed his door and put a chair underneath the doorknob. Someone started knocking on his door softly and tried to open it. He jumped on his bed and hid under the covers. Next thing he remembers, it's morning. I didn't know what to say and settled him down by pushing it was only a nightmare. Every window was closed and locked at night after that. The knocking continued over the years, making it impossible to truly relax in any home. When my son turned 18 and went away to college, the knocking ceased. I couldn't believe it. A few months later, my husband and I moved into a small cabin on top of a mountain, far away from the city and neighbors. After a year, our son came to our new home for summer break. A few nights later, all was quiet until we were woken by 2 gunshot sounds echoing from the living room. Bursting into the room, we find our son sitting up on the couch, holding his dad's old shotgun, pointing it at the window facing him from across the room. It was completely shattered by gunshot. He's screaming at the carnage, "Leave me alone!" My husband gently took the shotgun from our son and I guided him into the kitchen. He broke down and told us about this knocking that has followed him his entire life, even to college. and here he was being awoken by something knocking on the roof. Scared, he had grabbed a shotgun. A dark figure hung like a bat over the window and knocked on it. He fired. I thought back to when it started. The knocking was first heard when I learned I was pregnant and stopped when he moved out. So it had been following my son? How did whatever it was even know I was pregnant? What could it be? And why is it doing this? The next morning, my husband found large drops of something thick and black on the ground around the window. Assuming it was blood, he followed a trail of it that led into the forest. He figured our son had at least heard it, and maybe it got the message to stay away. We don't talk about it anymore. I have never heard the knocking again, and if my son still hears it, he's keeping it to himself. The operator answered the call at 3:31 a.m. 911. A frightened-sounding, softly sobbing woman in a voice barely above a whisper begged, "Help! He's here looking for me. Please help me now." The operator responded, "We can send help, but I need your address." The woman gave it to her before hanging up. The operator tried calling back, but only got an automated message saying the call could not be completed. She sent a patrol car to the location. The police parked on the street to find an abandoned house on the verge of collapse at the address. No electricity and no one inside. After checking with a neighbor, learned the house had been empty for years. They left convinced it was a prank. The next night at 2 a.m., a 911 operator received another call from the same woman. She was frantically begging for help, kept stating he was looking for her, and just like the other night, she hung up before any additional information could be obtained. Dispatch sent another patrol car to the location, but they could find no one in the house or in the yard. The next 5 nights, 911 received 2 more phone calls from the same woman using the same number. The police had had enough and decided to find the pranksters. They tracked a number with the phone company and found out it did once belong to the address, but had been turned off years ago. The number had never been recycled. It deepened the mystery of who was making the phone calls and how. The police contacted the owner, an older man who lived outside of town. He knew nothing about any 911 calls coming from his place, obviously angry about anyone being inside his house. Staking out the house was the next step. That night at 3:30 a.m., an officer watched as the owner drove up with the car headlights off, pulling the driveway before walking in the house as if he did not want anyone to see him. A few minutes later, 911 operations called him, informing him a call had been received from that location. The officer waited, and an hour later, the owner left. The next week, the police watched as the owner came back 3 times, sometimes with tools like shovels and crowbars, always between 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. What was he doing in the house so late at night with no lights? The investigation showed the calls came whenever he visited the house. One night, after he arrived, the officers decided to take a look around the house. Hearing bangs and grunts, they knocked on the back door. No answer. The banging and grunts continued. Fearing the homeowner may be hurt, they came in. Following the noises, they found him turn a section wall down in what was once a dining room. Catching him totally by surprise, the owner was shocked, holding a hammer in midair. "Is everything all right, sir?" one of the officers asked. The owner got irate, insisting they leave at once. As they asked him questions to why he was here in the dark remodeling, the more irate he got. One of the officers shined his flashlight toward the wall that had been torn open and on closer inspection saw what looked like a woman's remains. A phone cord was wrapped around her neck with a rotary phone dangling against her chest. They arrested him on the spot. Medical examiner said she had been strangled, and tests showed it was the homeowner's wife who had disappeared 40 years earlier. A cold case. He was charged with her murder. During his interview, the police learned because he was selling the house, he needed to move the body. It explained why he was there so late at night. Every night that he came to work on the wall, his wife called for help. Did the police involved in the case believe a ghost was making the 911 calls? Let's just say the information was not put in the file. The police encounter more paranormal cases than most people think. It was 1954, and in Mrs. Bristol's community of West Virginia, there were very few phones in homes at that time. She had to share a party line with 5 other numbers, basically meaning that each had to take their turns sharing one phone line. And like today's smartphones, each phone had their own ring, so they would know whose number was being called. One afternoon in June, her phone rang 2 quick rings indicating it was her number. She picked up the receiver, but before she could even say hello, a series of different beeps came through, followed by a generic, emotionless voice that she could tell neither female nor male, saying, "Your number is up, 24307834, June 15." That was in 3 days, she thought. The next day, and at the exact same time, 1:17 p.m., she received the same phone call. She would try to interrupt and ask who it was, but it would just repeat the same beeps and message before disconnecting. She had contacted a phone company, but at that time all calls were routed by human operators who did not keep track of who called what numbers. There were no records of numbers like today's phone bills. There was just no way to know where the call originated from. And prank phone calls were not even heard of yet, so it never came up that it could be a hoax. Out of frustration, she had invited a couple of friends over at 1 p.m. to listen to the call when it came. They all agreed it was unusual. One said it was definitely a recording, and he suggested it might even be military related. There was an Air Force base about 50 miles outside of town. For 2 weeks the call came every day until it stopped. 6 days went by without any calls, until day 7 when her phone rang. She answered to hear a male's voice with an accent she could not identify say angrily, "Wake up down there and report, 24307834. Your number is up." Mrs. Bristol was fuming and said, "24307834 is not reporting. I'm staying right down here." It was dead silence for at least a minute. Knowing her reply had taken him aback, she smiled, liking the idea of throwing him off for a change. Keeping her voice level, she explained who she was and tried to convince him he was calling the wrong number. The man's next words were filled with tone as if trying patiently to get a child to understand as he replied, "Your number is up. You must report." Angry, she disconnected the call. The following day at 1:17 p.m., her phone rang. She didn't want to answer it, letting it ring several times before finally forcing herself to pick up the receiver. This time, a female voice with the same accent as the male voice was on the other end, asking kindly if she identified with the number 24307834. Mrs. Bristol said it meant nothing to her and pleaded for them not to call her back. The woman explained it was an error on their part and would not bother her again. Mrs. Bristol was relieved to hear this and thanked her. The unknown woman ended the call with these strange words, "Luna is above, Earth is below."